Welcome to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. Join host Susan Gibson as she summons the courage to ask the hard questions, probes deep, dark secrets, and attempts to fill in the gaps while exploring the relationship between her and her mother. Discover the magic of self-discovery, relationship exploration, and the profound journey of forgiveness. Now, your host, Susan Gibson.
Have you ever wondered how far down you need to descend into the depths before you hit bottom with the hope that you will reemerge transformed? This is a question I've pondered over the past 12 years, with the last few focusing on my reemergence. If you've been listening to previous episodes of my podcast, you know that I read a lot. Part of my exploration since my mother died in 2021 has been the heroine's journey, defined by Maureen Murdoch, a topic that I explored in great detail with my therapist in the year following my mother's death, and a sort of blueprint for my family fairy tale. In her book, The Heroine's Journey, Woman's Quest for Wholeness, Maureen Murdoch says that our descent into the belly of the whale is usually precipitated by a life-changing loss. When you face truths about yourself in your world is when you can open yourself up to transformation. The descent allows us to gain wisdom of the cycles of change, accepting the dark, instinctive side, which helps us find meaning in suffering and death, as well as the light, joyous side, which reaffirms our strength, courage, and life. I've identified 13 different life-changing losses, all of which created a moment of transformation for me, moments that have combined into allowing me to reemerge into the woman that I am today. The first was the break with my mother in my teenage years. That definitely started my descent into the dark underbelly, into the belly of the whale, or the dark underbelly of the world. But it also was a moment of transformation for me. And when I look back at that time in my life, and what radically changed for me was looking inward to myself for preservation, for my resilience, for my ability to keep moving forward no matter the odds I was faced with. When I graduated from high school, then my college years, the beginning of my professional career, and got married, my break with the feminine came as part of my marriage and the role that I assumed in my marriage. And that also was a continuation of my descent, as well as moment of transformation. I allowed that to happen to myself. I was not an unwilling participant in my marriage, nor took on the role in my marriage unwittingly or unknowingly to me. What I didn't realize is the descent that I was on, and those 25 years of marriage that I was in required me to hit a certain bottom. It wasn't the bottom, but it was a bottom in my descent that started to turn me around in a moment of transformation. And I wasn't aware of that transformation that was going on inside of me, that I was preparing myself to leave my marriage. But I did, and I was. And it opened a whole new universe to me when that happened, And thirdly was the break with my professional self. And I would say, though, that loss, really put me into an accelerated descent. And it was again a moment of transformation for me. I had to transform in order to survive what I called survival in my professional world, because I no longer had any of my community around me at that time. And I ventured out on my own and built a successful career after that descent. I had not hit the bottom yet, though it felt very deep. And, the betrayal that came from that break with my professional self was very real. I felt it very acutely. But I did transform in that moment. I learned a lot from that moment in my life. And one thing that I learned was that I needed to be in control of my destiny, if you will. I thought I'd been in control up to that point, but I was not. And we cannot control destiny. It kind of comes to us in many different shapes, forms, and in unexpected directions, in sources. But I knew that I needed to be the leader in my own life, in my professional career, in my personal life, in the relationships that I had, and really needed to take a discerning eye and look at all of those relationships around me and be the leader in my own life. And myself as leader emerged following that third life-changing loss that I went through. And one thing that happened as a consequence of that, I can't say a consequence of, but in parallel, when you think about the descent, descent, because it's going down, it has a negative connotation, but actually plunging into the depths, kind of into those fires of transformation, is not a negative experience. It feels like you're suffering terribly when you're in it, but that emergence of self is not negative at all. But it's scary. It's terrifying, because transformation means you're changing into something different than what you were before, and that's frightening. It's going to kick in all of your instincts around surviving that you've known so far, and you've got to just let all of that go to allow your true self to emerge. And at this point after these 3 life-changing losses, I was still descending and transforming along the way. They were happening in parallel. I'm reading a book now. I like to read a lot of fiction as well. And in it, the school teachers telling a young girl, 2 truths can exist at the same time. They may seem diametrically opposed, but they're not. 2 truths can coexist. And this little girl is very puzzled by that, and she's pondering this in her own life. She's not even 10 years old, and pondering this. And when I think about descent and transformation, those are 2 truths that coexist. It's not one or the other, they coexist. So one thing that had happened to me as I continued this descent was my physical transformation. I became very focused on my health and well-being, and fitness played a big role in that. And I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I was not surrounded by people who gave me the type of positive energy I needed at that time in my life. I didn't want to expose my transformation to them until I emerged into whatever new being I was going to be at that point. And so I just started it without saying a word. And I changed my eating habits. I started exercising and having that be an important part of my lifestyle changes. And over the subsequent several years, I lost a lot of weight, and very slowly. And it was remarkable. I had become somebody I didn't recognize, either emotionally or physically. And I knew I needed to make some changes. And I felt like the physical transformation was well within my reach. I had not yet learned the words and the techniques, if you will, and the tools I needed for my emotional transformation. It was coming, but I wasn't there yet. My physical transformation started. It was remarkable what that did for me around making me feel like a new person. And it definitely started me towards a much larger transformation that I didn't know was coming. One additional loss was the end of my marriage. And I wasn't aware I was leaving my marriage until I had that realization. And it really was kind of like waking up one day and saying, I've left my marriage. And, it was quite remarkable to me that had happened. But I'd realized that so much was changing inside of me that even though I was going through the motions of continuing to build a life with my husband at the time, it was just that. It was going through the motions. It was very mechanical. And I no longer had the emotional attachment to those actions any longer, or to the people in our greater community as a married couple. And I realized I was leaving my marriage, and I owed it to him. I had great respect for him. I still do have great respect for him, to tell him that I'm leaving, that our marriage, from my perspective, from my emotional needs and attention, was over. Huge moment of transformation and fear. Spending 25 years with somebody is no joke, and leaving that, there's fear associated with that for sure. I did feel fearful, but also excited about the possibility of what was coming. And I rejoice in that possibility. That's all I was consumed by that, about my potential, and opening myself up to the universe to guide me, let me know where does she want me to go next. And I, with great confidence and energy, stepped into that new being of a divorced woman. And I revel in that persona to this day, actually. That opened up the universe to guide me towards my observer. The first guide that I had into the netherworld of my descent, and my life partner. And he had the words and the tools and the techniques to share with me to go deeper into my descent, to plunge deeper into the depths. And I remember my first experience with this, that it was in a 3-day retreat where he was a guide. There were other people there with me as well. I was not alone with my observer, guide, and new life partner. But what he opened my mind and heart to was all of the pain and suffering that I had experienced up to this point in my life. And that was about 12 years ago. And I had never explored that side of myself in such detail. I'd never cried so long as I did in those 3 days. I poured out my heart and soul into all of the influences of my life, all of my self-sabotaging behaviors, all the things that were holding me back to realize who I really am as a woman, as a person here in the world. It taught me about discernment, how to explore relationships in a constructive way, to understand who were those individuals who were giving me energy equal to the energy I was giving them, and who were not, and making difficult decisions about which relationships I wanted to continue to nurture and grow and develop, and which ones I no longer wanted to put any energy into. Incredibly eye-opening. And while I felt like I had hit the bottom on my descent, I was not there yet. But boy, was I on the way. An enormous transformation came from that. That opened me up to, like I mentioned, a whole new language, a whole new set of tools and techniques to help me express what was going on deep inside of me, help me to express my feelings and what was in my heart, and helped me become a heart-led leader that I am today, with confidence. And so many amazing things came as a result of that. Amazing and terrifying things. You know, another life-changing loss was actually forgiving my mother. And I really have been thinking about this as I was preparing for this episode, that while that brought so much change in our relationship with one another, it was fraught with fear, it was fraught with anger, and there was definitely a sense of loss, because relationship that we had, as imperfect as it was, died that day. The day that I told my mother, I forgive you. There was no going back. There's no retraction, no redacting, no taking a Sharpie and, crossing out the words. They were there in our hearts and minds with one another, and there was no way to delete the message. It was out there. And so there was a loss. There was a loss of the relationship that we had. Like I say, as imperfect as it was a relationship. And we were entering into completely new territory with one another. And our response to that moment of transformation differed, because we're two different human beings. And I couldn't predict what she was going to do in that moment. And I didn't know what I was going to do with the data I was receiving in that moment. I knew fundamentally something had shifted in both of us, at a huge moment of transformation for both of us. What that opened up was, oh goodness, the ability to form a new relationship, newfound relationship. It gave me so much confidence, actually. It was out there finally. It was out there finally. And all that anger and disappointment and despair and longing that I had had for my mother at that point, up to that point in time, was melted. It wasn't gone. Those traces are still there, buried inside of me, not so deeply buried anymore, thankfully. And when they emerge, I can say, yep, hi there. All right, there's the anger today. That's okay. We're just going to have a talk with myself, acknowledge that it's there, and let it pass on through. But, what came from it was such a confidence to build this relationship with my mother. I didn't know how many years we had left with each other. At that point, that was the year I turned 50, and I didn't know that, it's going to be just 9 more years together, but 9 good years, 9 years I'm thankful and grateful for, without any question. And my descent continued. That was not the end of my descent, but at this point, I was afraid to go any deeper. I was afraid. I'd gone very deep by this. I was afraid. There was I didn't know what was going to happen to me if I went any deeper, and I didn't know how I would emerge on the other side. Even though I now had the language and I had tools and techniques, and I continued to do an enormous amount of self-exploration, as well as leading workshops and retreats and speaking at events around the world, around all of these moments of transformation and tools and techniques that I had that had helped me enormously. I hadn't gone any deeper. And it was easy for me to step into the role of observer and facilitator, roles I'm very comfortable with, and not being actively engaged, even in my own transformation. Incredibly eye-opening when I look back and reflect on all of this. Those few years following the big moments when I turned 50, but I was afraid. When COVID hit, that was another acceleration into the descent for me, and another huge moment of transformation. The feeling of isolation that I felt when COVID hit, that my anxiety becoming the front runner in my life in those first couple of years of COVID, really opened my eyes to the descent. I was continuing to descend. I reaffirmed my commitment to health and fitness as well, completely reevaluated what I was eating, how I was eating, and my fitness. I needed the structure that all of that brought as well. That was a managing technique for my anxiety. However, it also was a recommitment to myself that I needed to be healthy inside and out. And that was an important step in my descent, an important new transformation for me. I had gone very deep at this point with COVID, very, very deep indeed into the depths. But I wasn't yet to the bottom. However, because two truths can coexist, I was starting a reemergence as well. COVID brought me deep, deep down in, and I had withdrawn immensely from the world, and I did start my reemergence as COVID progressed, and then we got past the really brutal years of the pandemic, and my reemergence started, and I started to get back out into the world, and I was terrified. My first speaking engagement in person, I was terrified. I was flying again, staying in a hotel, something I'd done for the most of my adult life. I was a weekly traveler for my work and for pleasure, and I had withdrawn from all of that. And that emergence, the reemergence of Susan, was frightening to me. And I did it, and I kept working at it. It wasn't like I wasn't fearful, and then suddenly I was fearless. It was in stages. It was in stages. I continue to put myself out there as often as I can, whether I really feel like it or not. I think that's an important part of my overall transformation and understanding the depths of my plunging in my descent, for sure. Then the death of my mother in 2021, September 2021. Oh, goodness. Again, the descent and the transformation that came from that, and leaving her to die alone in hospice care. That was a necessary step in my descent. That was my final break with her in her earthly form. And I needed that. I knew she was being well taken care of. And I knew she would want for me whatever I needed for myself to take care of myself. That left a huge opening. And I went into therapy for a year with just an amazing Jungian psychoanalyst. And we went deep into the heroine's journey. She was my active guide in the heroine's journey. And she helped me to complete my descent as I know it today. Not to say there won't be more stages of my descent, but I do feel complete in having made my descent and starting my reemergence. Like I say, it started a few years, in parallel with that descent, and with COVID and everything else that was going on, and my reemergence was coming about, if you will, throughout those years. But she really helped me to understand that I can hit the bottom and that I will emerge as a whole person. I will not be a shattered person. I will be a whole person. And that opened me up to new experiences, like starting this podcast. Just amazing new experience that have come from this. And, when I take a look at this whole story of my fairy tale to this point, so many symbols that have been there, so many friends, family, sources of guidance and observation coming from places I never expected. And I am just filled with joy and such deep gratitude. I'm grateful every day, every single day, that I am emerging as a whole woman who's being true to herself to the best of my ability every single day. If you'd like to read some more modern accounts of the descent, I have two books that I highly, highly recommend. They're fictional accounts, but they're just amazing stories of descent and reemergence. And the first one is called The Forbidden Territory of a Terrifying Woman by Molly Lynch. And the protagonist is facing the destruction of our world due to the climate crisis. And she literally descends into the earth and becomes one with the roots and the detritus and the trees. She becomes a tree deep inside the earth, and she reemerges, as her own true self. Just a fascinating account of the descent and reemergence. The second is called Whale Fall by Daniel Krauss. And this is the protagonist is a teenage boy, and following the sudden death by suicide of his father, he seeks the truth in the ocean an environment that he had a shared experience with his father as divers, and it was the scene of his father's death. And he gets swallowed by a sperm whale and descends deep into the second belly of the whale, literally. And, he's facing all of our fears, that utter isolation, desperately alone, fighting for one's life, literally in this case. And in this fight for his life, his father comes to him, guiding him gently at times, taunting at times, but there with him as his guide into the depths of his descent and reemergent, hurt but whole. Highly recommend these two books if you want to read more in a fictional sense. So do you have a story of your own descent and reemergence? I'd love to hear it. You can email me at hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com. Thank you for being with me today and listening to my podcast, Finding Forgiveness, a Family Fairy Tale. I welcome your comments. A big thank you to the team at Produce Your Podcast for helping me share my family fairy tale. Until next time, I'm Susan Gibson, signing off with gratitude and appreciation.
Thank you for listening to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. To continue the conversation, visit findingforgivenesspodcast.com and send an email to hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com to share your story. Until we meet again.